Democrats. Now, Michael Schnell, MSNBC congressional reporter, and Michelle Norris, MSNBC senior contributing editor. Michelle, I want to start with you because we have these two judges that say, get this money out, right? What we know about this contingency is that there isn't enough money to give everyone who is supposed to get it all of their benefits. So there will be people in this country that wake up this morning expecting, because this is how people plan for their lives, expecting to have money to be able to pay for food for their children, for themselves, and we're at the end of the month where they already are stretching every dollar that they have. Talk about the kind of yo-yo effect, the uncertainty that those folks are living in and what that does to them.
Okay, so yesterday was Halloween. So families that rely on SNAP had to already dig a little bit deeper to buy that Halloween costume, to buy the candy. And now at the first of the month, that's normally when you do your biggest shopping if you're on SNAP, right? Yeah. Because you try to load up because if things get tight later in the month, you try to make sure that you have a few extra cans of this or that. Even if the states come through, because you've got this interesting juxtaposition that a number of states are actually figuring out how to tap into emergency contingency
New York,
funding
Maryland,
there, right? And even if they come through and they provide some sort of contingency funding, there is a lingering effect here. And as you noted, this affects Republicans and Democrats. Hunger knows no boundaries. And people will remember, if you've ever experienced food insecurity, even when you satiate the hunger, the insecurity, the panic that you felt, not being able to know where your next meal is coming from, not being able to know if you're going to be able to feed your children, that is something that lingers. And when you've got this perfect storm of food insecurity, healthcare costs rising, and then Head Start being snatched from people who rely on that, this is a problem that the Republicans are going to have to deal with. And I think that that's why you're starting to see the break in the ranks and these, calls that have now been, we've learned about this. They're getting that messages, and they're not here in Washington. They're back at home. So they're seeing this firsthand. And this is going to be something that will affect the Republican Party. The Democrats will see some blowback from this also. But because you also have this juxtaposition of Trump saying that he can't figure out, whether we should follow the judge's ruling or not, and at the same time talking about his big marble bathroom. Right. So we've got this 18-karat confusion, that's going on where he can't figure out how to fund this, but at the same time, he's talking about building a ballroom, he's renovating his bathroom, and so it just, the confusion around this doesn't make sense.
Michael, on the point of the panic of food insecurity that Michelle was just talking about, I want to play some sound of SNAP recipients in Florida and New York and what they have to say about what they're going to be going through. Watch this.
I'm only down to 1 pack of chicken, and I don't even know what I'm going to do for the next month. My son won't have his milk, and we won't have food. I'll go without eating it or anything as long as my kids eat.
When you talk about your grandson, you got a little bit emotional.
That's my boy. That's my boy. And he's a kid. He doesn't deserve it. He shouldn't have to wake up and my daughter tell him he can't eat.
I mean, I'm glad we were able to play that sound so that we take it out of the theoretical and put it into the voices of people who are living with this. My question to you is, and my wonder is, do stories like that sound like that actually have any kind of impact on Capitol Hill?
I think in a way, yes, and in a way, no. So for the first part, this week was really the first time we actually saw the impasse kind of start to break. It didn't fully break. It maybe didn't even crack, but it sort of started to move in that direction. It was the first time in the 5 weeks of this government shutdown that we have seen a possibility of the light at the end of the tunnel. I think it's because a lot of lawmakers were nervous about this November 1st deadline. We always knew it would be open enrollment, and that really wasn't perturbing Republicans. But when you brought in the issue of SNAP, this is where it really got real for a lot of people. 42 million people on SNAP, districts across the country. That's why lawmakers were sort of saying, well, we're kind of optimistic this week. We feel like we're maybe getting there. But they didn't get there, and that's the point. And senators left town before we got this ruling from the courts that said, well, you actually have to put out the SNAP benefits. So it nudged things in the right direction, but it didn't get folks there. And that's been the fascinating part. We've spoken about it. That's been the fascinating part about this government shutdown is the pain points that you would expect to immediately immediately get a resolution. 42 million people losing their SNAP benefits would be within that camp. It just hasn't pushed the two parties into compromise because this impasse is so entrenched.
And Jonathan, your question actually reminds me of this line from Josh Hawley's op-ed in the New York Times this week, surprisingly advocating for SNAP to reauthorize it at least temporarily.
He's a huge SNAP recipient.
And he wrote, one suspects that if senators couldn't buy groceries, the government would never close down again. But Michael, can you also just set the stage for us on the status of negotiations with regards to the broader shutdown? You were on the Hill this week, had a lot of great reporting. Are conversations actually starting to happen?
I mean, they're happening, and they've been happening since the beginning of the shutdown at this rank and file level. We've seen different bipartisan Democrats and Republicans have these conversations, but they haven't bore any fruit yet, and that's the big issue. And so, again, we saw this optimism from lawmakers this week, and I've been talking to them every single day. I hadn't heard this cheerfulness from any of them in a very long time, especially during the shutdown. So there's this thought that maybe because there are these increased conversations, we're getting somewhere. But again, to the point I was making before, we haven't gotten there yet. So Lisa Murkowski, for example, she said people can be talking, but those conversations actually need to lead to something in order to get a resolution and get out of this. For this entire shutdown, both sides have been talking past one another. Democrats say we're not opening the government unless you extend the subsidies. Republicans are saying we're not extending the subsidies unless you open the government. I mean, just completely talking past each other, ignoring one another's opinions because they both think that they're right. So, yes, we saw increased conversations, discussions, and optimism this week. But whether it actually leads to a resolution, that's still the million-dollar question. And to the point you guys were making before, the fact that they weren't able to get there with SNAP benefits being dried up in just a matter of days, not a great sign, but I think we're in a better place than we were maybe 3 weeks ago.
Oh, great. Those were the bad place
Not
3
saying
weeks ago.
much,
Yeah. But, you know, one of the things that's so interesting is, you know, them all having conversations, the rank and file, no shade to them, but like, it doesn't matter what they think, right? At the end of the day, leadership needs to be having conversations. Right. It doesn't appear to be a lot of conversations. And most importantly, the president needs to be involved, especially this president, Michelle, because, you know, in other negotiations, whether it's shutdown or debt limit funding negotiations, the president, whoever it is very involved, especially as it drags on. President Trump's been a week in Asia. Met with Xi, great in China, great. You know, he should be doing that. But I remember when President Biden canceled a trip to Australia to do debt ceiling negotiations, and he left town yesterday, went to Mar-a-Lago to hang out with, you know, throw some big fancy party for Halloween. He's supposed to be the deal maker, right? He wrote the book, or somebody wrote the book with his face on it, called The Art of the Deal, and that's what he has prided himself on. And yet, he's about to have possibly the top. Right now, he has 2 of the longest shutdowns in history with no negotiations in sight. He doesn't seem to be as interested as he should be in this.
Well, it shows the dysfunction of the White House, and again, how this is not functioning as a White House we would normally see. Normally, the White House has the Legislative Affairs Office, which basically functions as its lobbyist, and you may have seen a little bit of it yesterday with Trump kind of backtracked on, you know. His social post number 1 and social post number 2. The language in social post number 2 looked like someone had actually whispered in his ear and suggested this is not looking good for you. But normally you would have people in that office and chief of staff and others who are basically working the Hill and trying to like bring people together. You're not seeing this in the White House. In this White House, he doesn't take counsel from other people. He's not interested in this. And so I think it's really going to depend on folks on the Hill, maybe getting a sign from him, but not direction from him specifically, because even though he talks about the art of the deal, the way that he's negotiated on Wall Street or in New York, you know, as a developer, is very different in Washington. He functions as a king because he can't lead as a president. And those are 2 very different things. I mean, the president has to, it's about not necessarily coercion, it's about cooperation, it's about comedy, it's about trying to bring people together to actually negotiate. Negotiation in Washington is something very different than the sort of strong-arm tactics that he's used as a developer.
Yeah, it is a seemingly one-way conversation from one end of Pennsylvania to the other, unlike the usual business the way business is conducted. But Trump is this morning waking up to a headline on the New York Times homepage that I don't think he's going to be happy about, which is everything Gene, you just pointed out, which as the shutdown pain grows, Trump attends to other matters. I mean, Michael, what are you hearing about the conversations between Trump and Senator Thune and Speaker Mike Johnson? Is Trump, do you think are we going to see a meeting next week? Is Trump going to finally open up the line to Democrats?
He's suggested, folks have suggested that he'd maybe be open to it. I know that there are certainly lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who want that to happen. Republicans have always called President Trump their closer. It was particularly a line we heard often during the big, beautiful bill negotiations that President Trump would come in at the last minute, strong arm some members into place, and then the bill would pass. We're hearing the same thing, but interestingly enough, from both sides of the aisle this time, Democrats and Republicans saying nothing is going to happen until the president gets involved. Particularly Democrats are saying that President Trump needs to give his members the okay so then they can wrap this thing up. Up until this point, to your question, Jackie, they've said that they've all been on the same page. Speaker Johnson and Leader Thune like to say all the time that they've spoken to the president. They're in lockstep and that there's unity in the Republican Party. But interestingly enough, Democrats have kind of been a little effusive of President Trump throughout the past few weeks. It seems like trying to goad him to the negotiating table. We hear from Leader Schumer all the time. Well, President Trump is a negotiator. He's a deal maker. Let him strike a deal this time. I think that in a lot of people's back of their heads, it's that 2018 Oval Office meeting when President Trump said that he would take responsibility for the shutdown if it happens. I think that's the reason why particularly Leader Schumer had really pushed for that initial Oval Office meeting a few weeks ago before the shutdown had happened. So certainly Democrats are pushing for one. Will it happen? Do John Thune and Speaker Johnson think that would be the best thing when they've sort of have this strategy going? Maybe not, but the president's back from Asia, and there are certainly a lot of lawmakers who want him to get involved. And not to mention one more thing, right when he got home from Asia, he entered the conversation with that filibuster call. So it may be an indication that he wants to get involved, or is at least paying attention now that he's back stateside.
Or at least wants Republicans to do what he says.
Right. Yes. And once he jumps in, they will do what he says because he functions as a king because he can't lead as a president. I love that.
He rests on right.
Wrote it down. Here it is.